So imagine for a second that a paramedic arrives at the scene of a really severe car accident, right? And the patient is just delirious from a head injury. They're terrified, running on pure adrenaline.
Yeah, literally fighting for their life in their own mind.
Exactly. And because of that, they start thrashing around. They're throwing punches at the very person trying to save them.
Mm.
Now, the paramedic, well, they don't punch back.
Right.
They don't take the assault personally. They don't suddenly view this terrified patient as an enemy that they need to defeat in some sort of wrestling match.
Because that would be counterproductive to the whole mission.
Completely. The paramedic understands that the aggression is just a symptom of a much deeper crisis. I mean, they are fighting the injury, actively and physically working to preserve life, while at the same time just sort of managing the chaotic behavior of the person they're trying to save.
And, that approach, it requires a highly specialized mindset. It really demands that the professional separates the human being in front of them from the problem that the human being is currently causing.
Right. The behavior is the obstacle, not the person.
Exactly.
Well, welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are so glad you're joining us again as the third person in this conversation, because today we're looking at a document that asks a really radical question based on that exact paramedic analogy. What if we treated all human conflict exactly like that?
Which is a huge mental leap.
It is. What if the default response to interpersonal friction or societal tension or even geopolitical conflict wasn't to just destroy the opponent, but to diagnose the underlying injury and treat it systemically?
Yeah.
Today, we are opening up a really fascinating text. It's called the Peaceful World Blueprint version 1.0, specifically the public academic version.
And we should clarify, we're going to look exclusively at the structural core of this blueprint today.
Right.
We aren't going to be skimming the overarching theories on, economics or technology that are in there.
No, we're getting hyper-focused.
Right. We are putting the entire weight of our focus on a single, incredibly dense operational node. And that is point 16. It's titled The Power of the Nonviolent Spirit, emphasizing the power of persuasion and humanization.
Yeah, because the rest of the manifesto, I mean, it outlines this massive interconnected system, but point 16 basically operates as the behavioral engine for the whole thing.
It's the beating heart of it all.
Exactly, because if a society fundamentally misunderstands how to resolve conflict at the individual or institutional level, then all those grand structural ideas about ecology or resource management, they just collapse.
They're built on sand, basically.
Right. So point 16 addresses the literal mechanism of human interaction. It dismantles this historical, culturally ingrained idea of what nonviolence is and replaces it with an active, highly engineered, and honestly a learnable discipline.
And we really need to unpack that word, nonviolence, because it carries a massive amount of historical and, well, psychological baggage.
Oh, totally.
For decades, the public consciousness has largely internalized nonviolence as a negative definition. Like it is simply the absence of violence. It's defined almost entirely by what you don't do.
Right, like you don't strike back, you don't escalate.
Exactly. And for a significant portion of the population, that intuitively feels like a synonym for passivity, or worse, just a willingness to be a victim.
It sounds like a moral high ground built on tactical surrender.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
But the blueprint actually attacks that stereotype in the very first sentence of point 16. It reads, and I'll quote here, "Nonviolence for us is not passivity and not a struggle against people. It is an active culture of persuasion, compassion, and the preservation of human dignity in conditions of conflict."
The phrasing there, active culture, that fundamentally reorients the whole concept. It shifts nonviolence from the static moral identity into a dynamic, continuous process.
Something you actually do, not just something you are.
Right. A culture isn't something you just declare.
Yeah.
It's an environment you cultivate through daily, repeated behaviors, shared language, structural reinforcement. I mean, just as a biomedical culture requires specific nutrients and conditions to grow in a lab, an active culture of nonviolence requires continuous, deliberate inputs.
Otherwise, it just decays.
Exactly. It decays right back into our default tribalistic responses.
Okay, so let's unpack this with an analogy. Think of traditional conflict as a giant game of tug of war. You have your side, they have their side, you're both holding this rough rope, and the sole objective is to use sheer force to drag the other party face first into the mud.
Right. Their failure is the literal prerequisite for your success. It's a zero-sum mechanism.
Exactly, zero sum. So when the text explicitly states this is not a struggle against people, it's essentially demanding that we drop our end of the rope.
Which is terrifying for most people.
It is. But dropping the rope doesn't mean walking away from the problem. It means walking around the mud pit, standing next to the other person, and looking together at whatever structural issue caused the tug of war in the first place.
And that cognitive shift, from viewing the person as the problem to viewing them as a partner in solving a mutual problem, that is notoriously difficult to maintain under stress.
Oh, yeah. Your brain just doesn't want to do it.
It really doesn't. When we perceive a threat, whether it's physical or just social, our neurobiology is hardwired to lock onto the source of that threat. The opposing soldier, the difficult coworker, the political rival.
Our brain just highlights them in red.
Exactly. Our cognitive framing isolates them as the obstacle that must be removed. So by declaring that the struggle is not against people, point 16 is asking practitioners to override their own threat detection software.
But let me push back on this a little bit, for your sake, as you're listening to this. Because look at systemic aggression. Look at, say, a hostile corporate takeover designed to gut a community's employment, or a dictator launching an unprovoked military campaign.
Right. High-stakes malice.
Yeah. If we aren't fighting the people orchestrating those events, how does an active culture actually engage with that level of organized aggression without just getting steamrolled? I mean, if we drop the rope, don't we just get dragged into the mud anyway?
It's the most common question, and the answer lies in the second half of that foundational sentence. The phrase, the preservation of human dignity in conditions of conflict.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, in traditional strategic thinking, whether you're in a boardroom or a war room, attacking an opponent's dignity is almost always viewed as a legitimate, even necessary tactic.
Right, you shame them?
You shame them, you humiliate them, you isolate them socially, you treat them as fundamentally lesser. The entire goal is to break their psychological resolve.
Basically backing them into a corner so tight they have no choice but to concede.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the behavioral data, and frankly the entire history of human conflict, shows that humiliation is the single most potent accelerant for violence.
Oh, wow. Accelerant. That's a strong word.
It is, because when you strip away a person's dignity, or a nation's dignity for that matter, you inflict an existential wound. A human being whose core identity and self-worth are under attack will almost always escalate.
Because you've left them with absolutely nothing to lose.
Precisely. When survival of the ego is on the line, people will burn the entire system down rather than submit to humiliation.
So attacking someone's dignity to score a quick tactical win actually guarantees a strategic loss in the long run.
Yes.
It just ensures the conflict is going to metastasize, last longer, and inflict exponentially more damage on everyone involved.
Conversely, actively preserving an opponent's dignity, even while you are vigorously dismantling their harmful actions, blocking their resources, or halting their advance, doing that changes the entire architecture of the conflict.
Because it leaves a psychological bridge intact.
Exactly. You are sending a dual signal. You're saying, I will use every active measure to stop the harm you are causing, but I refuse to degrade your fundamental worth as a human being.
Right.
This provides them with an exit strategy that doesn't require complete ego death. It allows for de-escalation without the unbearable cost of losing face.
But I mean, that requires a level of cognitive control that feels almost superhuman in the heat of the moment.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it's relatively easy to respect someone's dignity during a theoretical debate or a polite dinner party, but the text specifically says doing this in conditions of conflict. It means maintaining that baseline of respect when the alarm bells in your head are just screaming, when your interests are directly threatened, when you are exhausted and angry.
Which is precisely why they frame it as an active culture, rather than just a passive personality trait. It is a highly technical discipline.
You have to work at it.
You do. You don't just naturally default to preserving an attacker's dignity. You have to train for it exactly the way emergency responders train to administer complex medical procedures while a vehicle is actively on fire.
Right.
The environment is completely chaotic, but the protocol remains rigid.
So if the enemy isn't the person, right? If we're not fighting people, then what exactly is the actual disease this culture is trying to cure? Because point 16 immediately pivots from that into a really clinical diagnosis.
It does.
The text states, we help to see the causes of violence in fear, trauma, and ignorance.
And that is a completely demedicalized, non-moralistic triad. I want you to notice what is absent there.
Yet the word evil.
Exactly. The text does not attribute violence to evil or demonic influence or innate malice or irredeemable corruption. It systematically strips away the whole good versus evil narrative that basically dominates our cultural storytelling and our political rhetoric.
It replaces the whole concept of a bad guy with a set of observable functional deficits.
Right. Let's break down that diagnostic triad, starting with fear. Because in a high-stakes geopolitical standoff or, a bitter institutional lawsuit, it rarely looks like fear from the outside.
No, it looks like aggression. It looks like a very calculated power grab.
But aggression is very often just the armor that fear wears. When we look at the neurobiology of escalation, we understand that fear is a primal survival mechanism. When a system, whether that's a single human nervous system or a vast state apparatus, when it perceives an existential threat, rational, long-term strategic thinking just shuts down.
The prefrontal cortex basically goes offline.
Completely bypassed in favor of immediate reactive measures designed to neutralize the threat. So violence is functionally a tragically misplaced preemptive strike.
Wow, a misplaced preemptive strike.
Yeah, and the perceived threat doesn't even have to be a physical weapon. It can be a threat to social hierarchy, economic stability, cultural identity. The organism is terrified, and it lashes out to create distance and safety.
Okay, so that's fear. The second component of the diagnosis is trauma. Now, we usually think of trauma as an individual psychological burden, right? Like PTSD from an accident or from combat.
Right.
But the text seems to be applying it here as a broad systemic driver of conflict.
It is, because trauma is basically the ghost of past violence dictating present behavior.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Unhealed trauma leaves a nervous system perpetually stuck in a state of hyperarousal. The baseline calibration for detecting danger is just fundamentally broken. So a traumatized individual or a deeply traumatized society with a history of oppression or warfare, they perceive even neutral stimuli as hostile.
They react disproportionately to minor slights because they aren't actually reacting to the present moment.
Exactly. They're reacting to the compounded weight of historical injuries. Their internal alarm system just never stops ringing, which makes preemptive aggression feel like the only logical mode of existence.
Man. Okay, and the final piece of the triad is ignorance. Now, calling systemic violence a product of ignorance could very easily be misinterpreted. It sounds almost like they are saying violent actors are just stupid.
Which would completely underestimate them.
Right. It underestimates the highly intelligent, very sophisticated planning that often goes into systemic aggression.
Well, ignorance in this specific framework is an epistemological deficit, not an intellectual one.
Okay, unpack that.
It is a literal lack of specific mental models. It's the absence of information regarding alternatives. Think about it. If an entire political leadership class or corporate management structure has only ever been trained in zero-sum competition, dominance hierarchies, and punitive control,
then they are literally ignorant of the mechanics of collaborative problem solving.
Exactly. It's the old adage, right?
Yeah.
If the only tool you have ever been given is a hammer, every complex systemic issue will inevitably look like a nail. They resort to violence because they literally lack the vocabulary and the structural tools to achieve their goals any other way.
But, diagnosing violence as a symptom of fear, trauma, and ignorance, that feels dangerous to some people. The critique we often hear is that this framework lets perpetrators off the hook.
The accountability critique.
Yeah. Like, if a leader commits atrocities because of historical trauma or epistemological ignorance, the victims don't care about the diagnosis. They just want the harm to stop. So doesn't this medicalized approach risk excusing the behavior?
That is absolutely the most persistent friction point when discussing nonviolent frameworks. But it conflates two entirely different concepts.
Okay.
Identifying a mechanical cause is not the same as granting moral absolution. Returning to your paramedic analogy from earlier, recognizing that the patient's aggression is caused by a cranial hematoma does not mean the paramedic simply stands there and allows themselves to be beaten.
Right. They still deploy restraints. They establish rigid physical boundaries.
They still act decisively to stop the harm. Understanding the mechanism of the violence doesn't negate the absolute necessity of protective force or structural containment.
So then why bother with the diagnosis at all? Why not just rely on the traditional framework? Define the actor as evil and use force to neutralize them. It's cleaner, it's faster, and honestly, it satisfies the human desire for retributive justice.
It does, but it's fundamentally flawed because of the levers of change.
Levers of change, yeah.
If you define a conflict using the framework of pure evil, you lock yourself into an endless, unwinnable paradigm. You cannot negotiate with evil. You cannot educate evil. And you cannot heal evil.
Right.
The only logical response to a fundamentally evil entity is its total eradication. It demands a search and destroy methodology. And because human beings will always have conflicting interests, there will always be a new evil to eradicate.
So you just end up burning down the entire world trying to purify it?
Precisely. It's a forever war. But if you shift the framework, if you diagnose the violence as a symptom of fear, trauma, and an ignorance of alternatives, you suddenly have access to functional levers. You can actually engineer solutions.
Right, because you can't shoot ignorance with a ballistic weapon. The weapon only generates more trauma for the survivors, which guarantees the cycle just keeps going.
But you can treat ignorance with education. You can treat fear with structural transparency and security guarantees. You can treat trauma with restorative systemic design. The blueprint essentially shifts our societal role from executioner to engineer.
Which flows perfectly into their methodology. Because the text doesn't just diagnose the societal disease, it actually prescribes a highly specific, actionable treatment plan.
It really gets down to the nuts and bolts.
It does. It states, we act as an educational and humanitarian-oriented movement. We spread knowledge about de-escalation, nonviolent communication, restorative approaches, trauma-informed practices, and the ethics of responsibility, overcoming them through the development of peace skills.
And that phrasing right there, development of peace skills, or Naviki Mira in the original language, that is the conceptual core of this entire blueprint.
It really is.
It categorizes peace not as a personality trait or a genetic predisposition or some sort of divine blessing. It frames it as a hard technical competency.
Which is wild because we hold this massive, unexamined assumption in our society that humans should just intuitively know how to navigate conflict.
We really do.
We assume that if you are a quote-unquote good person, you will just naturally know how to handle a complex emotional dispute with a partner or a high-stakes negotiation with a hostile contractor. And when people inevitably fail at that, when they yell or escalate or resort to coercion, we judge them as morally defective.
As if they failed a character test.
Right. But this blueprint treats peace like software engineering or aviation or playing a complex musical instrument. I mean, you aren't born knowing how to land a commercial jet, and you aren't born knowing how to de-escalate a nervous system in hyperarousal.
The societal disparity in how we allocate training resources is honestly staggering if you think about it.
Oh, it's massive.
We invest decades and literally trillions of dollars educating populations in the highly technical skills of commerce, law, warfare.
Right.
We train soldiers in ballistics, logistics, and close quarters combat with rigorous, scientifically optimized methodologies.
Yeah.
We train lawyers in the precise mechanics of adversarial debate and legal maneuvering. But when it comes to the fundamental mechanics of human connection, emotional regulation, and nonviolent conflict resolution, the curriculum is entirely blank.
It's non-existent.
We essentially place human beings into a complex, high-friction societal machine with absolutely no operational manual. And then we act surprised when the gears grind to a halt in a shower of sparks.
But the blueprint actually provides the manual, so let's look at the specific chapters they've outlined. The first skill they list is de-escalation. Now, in popular culture, de-escalation usually just means telling someone to calm down.
Which historically has a 100% failure rate.
It never works.
Ever. Telling a person in a state of amygdala hijack to calm down is functionally pouring gasoline on a fire.
Yeah.
It invalidates their emotional state and signals that you do not understand the perceived threat, which obviously only heightens their fear. True de-escalation is a tactical, real-time intervention designed to manipulate the neurochemistry of the room.
So how do you actually do that?
Well, it requires immense self-regulation first. The practitioner must consciously control their own autonomic nervous system, lowering the pitch and volume of their voice, adopting non-threatening, open body language, pacing their speech to create a rhythm of predictability.
You are essentially trying to hack the other person's threat detection system. You're acting as an external regulator for their nervous system until their own prefrontal cortex can boot back up.
Exactly. You are systematically removing all stimuli that the opponent's brain could interpret as an attack, and simultaneously acknowledging the reality of their distress without necessarily agreeing with their narrative.
Which is so hard to do.
It is an incredibly demanding cognitive task, especially when the other person is actively directing hostility right at you. It requires the practitioner to completely decouple their own ego from the interaction.
Okay, the next tool in their arsenal is Nonviolent Communication, or NVC. And this is often vastly misunderstood. People think it just means being polite, or using soft corporate HR jargon to mask disagreements.
Oh, yeah, the HR voice?
Right.
But that's not it at all.
Right. NVC is actually a rigid linguistic framework designed to bypass defensive triggers.
It was developed by clinical psychologist Marshall Rosenberg, and it operates on the premise that all human behavior, even the most tragic or violent, is basically an attempt to meet a universal human need.
Okay.
The linguistic structure of NVC forces the speaker to separate objective reality from their subjective evaluation of that reality.
Okay, let's run a simulation of this so you can see the mechanics in action. Imagine a high-stress environment, say a hospital administration board meeting, and one director constantly interrupts another during critical planning phases.
Right, very common scenario.
The default tribal response is an attack. You say something like, "You are incredibly arrogant and you never listen to anyone else's ideas."
And that statement right there is a diagnostic failure because it mixes an observation, the interrupting, with a heavy moral judgment, the word arrogant. The moment the word arrogant is deployed, the recipient's defensive architecture activates.
They stop listening.
Completely.
Yeah.
They will no longer hear the core issue. Their entire cognitive load shifts to defending their identity against the accusation. The conflict instantly spirals away from the actual problem, the interruption, and becomes a battle over character.
Okay, so how does the NBC framework rewire that exact scenario?
It breaks the communication into 4 distinct non-combative components: observation, feeling, need, and request.
Observation, feeling, need, request.
Got it.
That.
First, the observation must be as objective as a security camera recording. No adjectives, no judgments. So you would say, in the last 3 meetings when I began to present the budget figures, you spoke before I finished my sentence.
Which is indisputable data. You cannot argue with the camera footage.
Exactly. Step 2 is stating the internal feeling, completely devoid of blame. You say, when that happens, I feel frustrated and disconnected. Then step 3 connects that feeling to a universal human need. Rather than blaming the other person's actions, you add, because I have a need for clarity and equal participation in these decisions.
Oh, this is the crucial pivot. Because you aren't saying, I feel frustrated because you are a jerk.
Right.
You are taking ownership of your own emotional state by linking it to your own structural needs. You essentially remove the target from their chest.
Which naturally leads to step 4, a clear, actionable, present tense request rather than a vague demand. You finish with, would you be willing to let me finish the entire budget presentation before we open the floor for critique?
Okay, so observation, feeling, need, request. When we map it out here in a quiet room, it makes perfect logical sense.
It seems so simple.
But deploying that 4-step architectural framework when your heart is pounding at 120 beats per minute, your face is flushed, and you feel deeply disrespected, I mean, that requires an unbelievable level of mental conditioning. It really is like trying to execute emergency flight protocols while the cabin is losing pressure.
Which reinforces the blueprint's core thesis, right? Peace is a learned technical skill. You have to run the drills in the simulator 1,000 times so that the muscle memory takes over when the real-world alarms sound.
Yeah. And then the curriculum actually scales up from interpersonal communication to institutional design. It lists restorative approaches and trauma-informed practices.
Right. Moving from the micro to the macro.
Exactly. This is where point 16 moves from individual psychology to the architecture of society itself. Because our current default for managing institutional friction, whether that's in the criminal justice system, school disciplinary boards, or corporate compliance, is almost exclusively punitive.
The punitive model asks 3 specific questions when a fracture occurs. What law or rule was broken? Who broke it? And how much pain do we need to inflict on the offender to balance the scales and deter future violations?
It's just the institutionalized version of the tug-of-war. The state or the institution grabs one end of the rope, the offender is on the other, and the institution uses its overwhelming weight to drag the offender into the mud. They get expelled, fired, or incarcerated. The core assumption is that reciprocal pain equals justice.
But restorative approaches fundamentally reject that premise. They argue that reciprocal pain does not heal the underlying systemic fracture at all. It merely creates new trauma that basically guarantees future friction.
Right.
The restorative model changes the diagnostic questions entirely. Instead, it asks, what actual harm was done? Who was impacted by this harm? And what obligations and structural changes are required to repair the damage and ensure the harm is not repeated?
So it completely shifts the focus from punishing the offender to repairing the victim and the community.
Yes.
But how does that integrate with the trauma-informed practices part? Because incorporating trauma into institutional design sounds like a monumental logistical challenge. Like, how does a school or a courthouse do that?
Well, a trauma-informed system operates on the baseline assumption that a significant portion of the population is carrying invisible psychological injuries.
Okay.
It shifts the primary institutional question away from what is wrong with you and replaces it with what happened to you. Let's apply this to an educational setting, like you mentioned. In a traditional punitive school, a student who repeatedly acts out aggressively is viewed as a disciplinary problem to be removed.
They get suspended.
Right. And this isolation often compounds the very trauma that caused the aggression in the first place, leading to a really predictable pipeline of failure.
The institution literally treats the symptom by throwing the patient out of the hospital.
Precisely. A trauma-informed institution, however, recognizes the aggression as a stress response. So the physical environment is designed to minimize sensory overload. The staff are trained to recognize the subtle physiological cues of dysregulation before an outburst even occurs.
They're being proactive instead of reactive.
Exactly. And the disciplinary process focuses on uncovering the environmental triggers and teaching the student the exact self-regulation skills they lack. The institution engineers safety rather than engineering punishment.
Man. Let's run a thought experiment here to see the logical endpoint of this curriculum. Imagine a society that actually adopted Point 16 not just as a fringe philosophy, but as core infrastructure.
Okay.
Imagine a world where nonviolent communication, de-escalation, and trauma-informed logic were taught in primary schools with the exact same rigor, funding, and societal expectation as mathematics, literacy, and physical education.
It would completely rewrite the foundational operating system of the culture.
Man.
We can see the implications most clearly by looking at our current political and civic arenas.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, political debates, town halls, legislative sessions, they're basically gladiatorial combat.
Totally.
They're arenas built for dominance displays, rhetorical manipulation, zero-sum point scoring. Politicians achieve power by intentionally triggering the fear and tribalism of the electorate.
Because the electorate currently lacks the peace skills to recognize they are being manipulated. They respond to the fear triggers because they haven't been trained to do otherwise.
Exactly. But if the baseline competency of the entire population included a deep understanding of de-escalation and NVC, the current political strategies would become instantly obsolete.
They wouldn't work anymore.
A politician standing on a debate stage using ad hominem attacks, fear-mongering, divisive rhetoric, they wouldn't be perceived as strong or decisive. They would be perceived as structurally incompetent.
The audience would look at a yelling, aggressive leader the same way a room full of structural engineers would look at someone trying to build a skyscraper out of wet cardboard.
Right. It wouldn't be intimidating. It would be profoundly embarrassing.
It would be an undeniable display of functional illiteracy in the realm of civic hygiene.
Exactly. The societal demand for collaborative, restorative problem-solving would naturally filter upward, altering the types of individuals who could successfully achieve leadership roles. The active culture would essentially act as an immune system, naturally rejecting leaders who rely on the pathology of fear.
See, this vision is just massive. It's an ambitious, generational planetary engineering project. It seeks to cure the disease of violence through an exhaustive, meticulous educational curriculum.
It does.
But this is where Point 16 makes a sudden, very jarring structural pivot. In its final paragraph, after laying out this world-changing agenda, the document draws a severe boundary regarding what the movement will absolutely not do to achieve its goals.
And it is the most strategically vital and perhaps the most easily misunderstood paragraph in the entire blueprint.
The text states, "We are not a political organization, do not coordinate protests, and do not publish tactical instructions. Our strength is in enlightenment, dialogue, supporting victims, and strengthening the culture of peace."
To a modern audience deeply conditioned by activism, this sounds inherently contradictory.
Yeah, it sounds like they're giving up.
Right. We live in an era where visibility is equated with efficacy. If you want to change the world, the accepted playbook dictates that you must form a political coalition. You must march in the streets. You must disrupt commerce. And you must directly and loudly confront the state apparatus.
That's just how it's done.
So by explicitly refusing to coordinate protests or engage in politics, the movement risks appearing detached, theoretical, or even cowardly in the face of immediate injustice.
It feels like they're building this incredible architectural blueprint for a new society, but refusing to pick up a megaphone to fight the zoning board. Like, how do they expect to dismantle systemic violence if they won't even organize a sit-in at the Capitol? Are they just going to sit in a room and read Marshall Rosenberg while the world burns?
It's a fair question, but the refusal to engage in conventional political warfare is not a retreat. It is a highly calculated masterclass in structural resilience.
Okay, explain that.
To understand the logic, we have to analyze the inherent fragility of the political arena. The fundamental mechanic of modern politics is division. It is the categorization of the population into competing factions vying for control over a monopoly on force, which is the state.
It's the ultimate tug of war.
Yes. The moment this movement endorses a political candidate, aligns with a specific party, or lobbies for a partisan policy, they enter the mud pit. By aligning with one faction, they automatically alienate and trigger the defensive mechanisms of the other half of the population.
Right.
They violate their own prime directive. The struggle is not against people, because in politics, the opposing party is the obstacle.
Going back to our core analogy from the start, if the paramedic arrives at the scene of the accident wearing the jersey of a specific sports team, the injured patient who supports the rival team is instantly going to distrust them. The patient might refuse the life-saving treatment entirely, purely based on tribal affiliation. So, to administer the medicine of peace skills effectively, the paramedic must remain universally neutral. They have to exist completely outside the tribal dynamic.
That neutrality is the only way to maintain access to the ignorance and fear they are trying to treat. Think about it. If a right-wing traditionalist and a left-wing activist both view the movement as a politically neutral educational resource, they can both sit in the same room and learn de-escalation tactics.
Yeah.
The moment the movement sponsors a protest against one of their ideologies, the trust is shattered. The movement becomes a perceived threat, the amygdala's fire, and the educational bridge just burns.
But what about the refusal to coordinate protests or publish tactical instructions? Even nonpartisan protests have historically been the primary mechanism for marginalized groups to force structural change. Why abandon civil disobedience entirely?
We have to differentiate between tactical interventions and infrastructural overhauls. A protest is a tactical intervention. It is a localized, concentrated burst of energy aimed at an immediate, specific grievance. It is the fire extinguisher responding to a flare-up in the kitchen.
Okay.
Protests are vital for immediate disruption, but they do not change the underlying flammable nature of the building materials.
And Point 16 isn't interested in being the fire department. They want to completely redesign the building code so the house ceases to be combustible in the first place.
Exactly. And to do that, they must survive long enough to actually lay the foundation. Political movements and protest organizations are inherently fragile. They exist at the mercy of election cycles, the charisma of their organizers, the really short attention spans of the media.
They burn out fast.
They do. And more importantly, when an organization publishes tactical instructions or coordinates mass disruptions, they place themselves directly into the threat matrix of the state.
They become a target. A regime can easily justify deploying force against a group that is actively trying to disrupt state operations.
Yes. By explicitly stating they are not a political organization and do not coordinate protests, the movement generates a massive layer of operational camouflage.
Operational camouflage? That's brilliant.
It is. If an authoritarian regime or even a highly defensive democratic institution evaluates this group, they do not see an insurgency. They do not see a revolutionary vanguard seeking to overthrow the government.
What do they see?
They see a benign, perhaps slightly eccentric educational NGO focused on communication skills, stress management, and humanitarian support.
So they essentially remove themselves from the radar of state violence by refusing to play the game that triggers state violence.
Right.
They are essentially saying, we don't want the throne. We don't care who sits on the throne. We're just going to quietly teach the entire peasant class how to read, how to communicate, and how to resolve disputes without needing the throne's intervention at all.
And that is the ultimate long game. They are hacking the culture, not the government. If you spend decades systematically treating the trauma of a population and replacing their ignorance of alternatives with robust practice peace skills, you fundamentally alter the soil from which the political system grows.
The population naturally self-corrects its own institutions. I mean, the movement doesn't need to coordinate a protest against a punitive justice system because an electorate that's completely fluent in restorative approaches will simply vote the putative judges out of office or rewrite the laws themselves.
The change bubbles up from the granular interpersonal level rather than being forced top-down through fragile coercive political power. It is systemic change achieved through individual enlightenment.
Which is slow.
It requires a timeline that most modern activists find excruciatingly slow. But from an architectural standpoint, an infrastructure built this way is virtually indestructible. It cannot be voted out of office, and it cannot be defeated by riot police, because it resides within the cognitive framework of the citizens themselves.
Wow. You know, this deep dive into point 16 has completely dismantled the way I look at conflict. It takes a concept that is so often relegated to passive idealism and reveals it to be this rigorously engineered, highly active discipline.
The logic of point 16 is really airtight. It moves seamlessly from redefining the core philosophy, to diagnosing the root causes of the failure, to prescribing a specific educational curriculum, and finally, establishing the strategic boundaries necessary to protect that curriculum. It is a complete, self-contained operational manual for human interaction.
Let's bring this all the way down to the ground level, just to you listening right now. Because it is incredibly easy to listen to an analysis of a global manifesto, marvel at the systemic architecture, and think of it as something that happens out there.
Right, like it's someone else's problem.
Something for the UN or politicians or sociologists to handle, but the active culture of point 16 does not exist out there. It exists entirely in the space between you and the next person you talk to.
The micro is the macro. The exact same mechanics that govern a geopolitical standoff govern a dispute over a property line or an argument in the kitchen about financial stress.
Think about the friction you are guaranteed to face this week. Maybe an employee misses a critical deadline, or a relative brings up a highly inflammatory political opinion at dinner, or a stranger cuts you off in traffic.
Oh, the traffic one is a classic amygdala hijack.
It is. When that friction occurs and your heart rate spikes, the blueprint forces a choice. Are you going to pick up the rope? Are you going to view that human being as the enemy, attack their dignity, and try to drag them into the mud?
Or can you step back and deploy the active culture? Can you identify the fear or the lack of tools driving their behavior? Can you formulate an observation without judgment, state your needs, and leave them a bridge to maintain their dignity?
Can you be the paramedic fighting the injury instead of fighting the patient? Because if point 16 is correct, a peaceful world is not a grand political destination. It is a daily technical practice.
And that brings us to a final underlying reality to consider as we wrap up this analysis. We have discussed at length the necessity of treating peace as a learned skill, a curriculum that must be intentionally taught and rigorously practiced.
The curriculum of peace.
Yes. So the question we are left with is one of societal allocation. What happens to a civilization that invests virtually unlimited resources, time, and intellectual capital into teaching its citizens how to compete, how to dominate, how to argue, and how to destroy, but leaves the curriculum of peace entirely blank?
We end up exactly where we are right now.
The constant polarization, the systemic aggression, the inability to resolve basic societal disputes without fracturing. Perhaps these are not signs that human nature is fundamentally evil, or that our species is destined to destroy itself. Perhaps they are simply the predictable results of a missing syllabus. We aren't failing because we are broken. We are failing because we haven't been doing the coursework.
That is a profound realization to carry with us today. Thank you for joining this deep dive into point 16 of the blueprint. We hope this exploration gave you some concrete tools to examine the mechanics of conflict in your own life. Remember the active culture, drop the rope, and we will see you next time.